Hello, all the nerds out there. I hope you all are doing fine. And guess what? Leave everything, whatever the nerdy stuff you guys are doing right now. So leave it and come here, gather around because today is going to be an exciting section that we're gonna cover, and it'll start from Middle English period. I know you are excited, and I'm too. And let's find out what is there. But before that, I always say what you have to do: just write hi in the chat box or in the comment, and of course like like this video, and do one thing, that is subscribe the channel. So anyway, so guess what, it is Middle English period, right? So this section, what we are going to do, we are going to cover a long period of English history, and it will start from 1050 to 1350, roughly 300 years, which had a lot going on in terms of transitioning from the earlier age. So we had new ruling dynasty coming in, and then conflict between different classes, and lots of war with France, Scotland, and Wales. But what mattered even more for literature were the general trends of the time, right? So we saw some kind of, the rise and decline of religious order, the popularity of chivalry and romance, which brought more sympathy for the poor and, of course, to women, and what the crusade, which broadened people's horizons and eventually led to the Renaissance, right? The Shakespeare age. So all of these were the sign of an increasing intelligence that had a big impact on the lifetime of this era, right? So in terms of language, things were changing too. Old English, as you know, the language used before, disappeared as a written language around when 1050. That we have already discussed in our previous section, where we had the introduction of Old English literature, and we also talked about Beowulf and other epic poetry, right? So here what it was, this Old English was replaced by Middle English, and that is a kind of mix of Anglo-French, which eventually became the ancestor of modern English. So this transition happened around 1200, when we started seeing Middle English text, like in the Brute. Like this text shows, these text shows how the language and words come in. Like the old grammar rules broke down, and most of the inflection were lost, right? So let's move to the introduction, and as you can see over this screen, everything is there all at once. You can take a screenshot if you want, otherwise you just listen to me, and this point you can read it later, right? So as I was telling you about that, old English words, were lost at that time, and lot of French words came in. Like what, the old grammar rule broke down, and what happened, most of the inflection were also lost, and the language also developed into different kind of dialogue. And guess what are these dialogues? That is northern, midland, and southern, and none of them were dominant until later in the period, when the midland dialect started to become more prevalent. So basically what happens here, Middle English developed from Old English, right, and changing its grammar, pronunciation, and spelling, and what they borrowed words from French and Latin. So Middle English literature refers to the writing in the English language when in the late 12th century until the 1470s. So during this time, English started to become more standardized, and what, because due to the Chancery standard, it is a kind of term used to refer to the 15th century written uses of the clerks of Chancery London, who prepared the king's document, and what this influence was can be seen in the printing press as well. So the literature didn't undergo significant changes until the Renaissance and the impact of Reformed Christianity, which became evident during King Henry VIII reigns. And Middle English literature can be categorized in three main types. And guess what? One is religious, right? Second is courtly love, and what, Arthurian legend, that we're gonna talk about later in this. So anyway, however, if you come to Chaucer, so this Geoffrey Chaucer's work stand apart from these categories, and especially these notable religious work include those by the Catherine group and the writings of Julian of Norwich and Richard Rolle, right? So guess what else happened there? The Norman conquest of 1066 didn't immediately change the English language or literature. So old poetry continued to be copied, and some poems in the early 12th century showed that alliterative verse was still being composed, and there in that century itself, rhyme started to replace alliteration in certain poems even before the conquest. So after the conquest, the influence of the new aristocracy led to law of French becoming the standard language for the court and also for the parliament and to the polite society. So Anglo-Norman and Latin were preferred for high culture people, and it it was used in administration. But English literature at that time didn't fully disappear. Several important works demonstrate the language's development. There is a layman's brute that we are going to talk about, then which was actually written around the turn of the 13th century, uh, and it is a Middle English work influenced by Old English. And what in the 14th century, major English literary works began to reappear, and these included the poems by the Pearl Poet, as you know, Piers Plowman by Langland, and of course Confessio Amantis by John Gower, and the works of our favorite Geoffrey Chaucer, who was highly regarded as a poet. The 15th century also saw the reputation of Chaucer's successor, and also it says like these successor decline in like comparison to him. And although Lidgate, Hakluyt, Skelton are still studied, so Scottish poetry had its origin what during this time with James the first of Scotland writing, who guess what he has written? He wrote the King's Choir, right? And again we have Robert Henryson, William Dunbar, and Gawain Douglas, and they were all notable Scottish poets. With Douglas's vision, I was talking about something else, but by the way, that's all. Uh, that's all in the introduction. Now, shall we move to the features? And guess what? The feature, as you can see over screen, there are like 10 points, I guess, and that's actually we can add more, but for you guys, that'll be enough. So, features. So, first is transition and experiment. So, this period was all about trying new things and figuring out what works. See, the old poetic techniques were fading away, and English poets were looking at both French and Latin model for inspiration. So over time, the native features of English poetry like alliteration, right, started to come back again. It took a while for the influence of the old tradition to regain strength after the Norman conquest. And again, we have anonymous authors at that time. So it's funny how many works from this time have no known author. So most of the authors we do not, we do know about are pretty much, just names without much detail. So we don't know about their life or, about them also. So there aren't any standout literary personality that we can point from this era. So the reason is partly that then people were interested in the poem rather than in the poet, right? So the medieval author was at a disadvantage. So compared with popular writers today in having no publisher interested in keeping the name before the public. And also the reproduction of books by hand gave them a like communal character, where a text changed due to both unconscious alteration and conscious change. So the different manuscript of a work often differed greatly from one another. So that was like in that anonymous author were there. We only know the poem, but we don't know about the poet, right? So again, the last one, if you talk about poetry, so it also poetry rules the roost. So when it comes to surviving metrical poetry, poetry dominates the scene. So it's used for all sort of stuff like history, geography, religion, even basic science. And a lot of it was mediocre monastery work. So the quality wasn't always kind of high standard. So compared to poetry, prose was seriously lacking. Most people were using Latin and French for writing, leaving English prose neglected. So the majority of the prose we have from this period consist of only sermons like the Ancient Reveille, and guess what? Most of them were just plain translation from from Latin with no unique style to speak of. So that is all about the feature. What we have, if you talk about Middle English, we have only what? The poetry there. There are also some prose, but focus was at that time was poetry. Right, so that was all about. And again, in our next class, there will be poetry. And our another nerd is going to teach you all. And she'll be talking about Middle English poetry. And also, she'll be talking about all the Arthurian or chivalric romances. So be there. It's going to be a very good class. You're going to love it. But anyway, now let's move. One of the most important thing that Middle English has is the major event during this 300 years. What has happened? Let's find out. So as you can see here, there are so many things so I'll just zoom in and we'll just dive into these events. So the first of all is you can see the Great Famine, which started 1350 to 1370. So these 2 years were dark days in Britain. So why this Great Famine happened? Let's find out. So this Great Famine that went down, you remember the date, 1315 to 1317, and what all the shit kind of things were happened at that. Not there, but all across Europe, from Russia to Italy. Can you believe it? So it was a major crisis that messed up the good times Europe was having in the 11th and 13th century. So that famine completely changed the scenario of the Europe. So it all started with what? Crappy weather in 1315. What happened? That screw up all the crops, and guess what? The crops kept falling until the summer of 1350. So it took Europe a complete long time to recover, not until 1322. And it wasn't just crops going down to the down, but also cattle got sick too, with sheep and cows dying like crazy. So 80% of them is gone. So this whole period was a nightmare, a kind of full crime, disease, mass deaths, and even people turning to cannibalism and killing babies. Can you really believe it? It was completely messed up here. So the whole thing screwed up the church, the government, and messed up European society, and it set the stage for more shit to come in the 14th century. And guess what? Our next is the Black Death. Here you can see the date is 1347 to 1352, 5 years. And guess what? So many things happened. Let me tell you. So let's talk about this Black Death, right? So this was kind of deadly plague that messed up medieval Europe from 1347 to 1352. Date is quite important for you guys. And guess what? How many people died? Can you write in the chat box if you are still there? But anyway, it killed 25 to 30 million people. Oh, how many zeros are there? Can you write in the chat box? But anyway, so the disease came from Asia. Those Mongol warriors and traders took it to the Crimea, and then it spreads like wildfire to Europe and through Italy on trading ships infected by who? Rats. So the plague was caused by some nasty bacteria carried by fleas on rats. That's why they called it the Black Death. Because why? You wanna know? It's because it turned your skin and sores black. So people were dropping like flies. And it's estimated that 30 to 50% of the population died in this affected area. And the death toll was so damn high that it had major consequences for medieval European society. So there weren't enough farmers left, so people started demanding an end to serfdom and questioning authority, and even what rebellion started. And whole town and villages were abandoned because everybody was dead, right? Or scared or shitless. But it was the worst plague ever. And it took Europe a freaking 200 years to recover the population it had before the Black Death. Wow, that's crazy stuff, right? So anyway, now let's move to the 100 Years War. And as you can see in your screen, that it started from 1337 to 1453. So this 100-year war, what happened? That went on from what? 116 years. That's a lot, right? From 1337 to 1453. It was like never-ending drama between who? England and France. And it all started when King Edward III of England and Philip VI of France got into a fight over what? Over some feudal rights in Gascony. And next thing you know, they're battling it out for the French crown. So spoiler alert for you all, France eventually came out on top and took control of the whole country. Except for Calais. So at first, the English were like killing it with big wins at the Battle of Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356. But then Charles V of France was like, no guys, we are taking our lands back. And suddenly what they started reclaiming what was lost. Then Richard II of England married the daughter of Charles VI of France, and there was a moment of peace for some time. But of course, the war had to explode, right? It had to explode back into action with the Battle of what? Agnicourt in 1450, won by who? Henry V of England. He even got nominated as the heir to the French throne. But his early death and the weak rule of Henry VI of England messed things up. So Charles VII of France took the lead with the help of Joan of Arc, and they sealed the deal with victories at Formigny in 1450 and Castillon in 1453. France was like, finally you got this, right? So that was all about the 100 Years War. Let's talk about the Peasants' Revolt here. So what this is also called Wat Tyler's Rebellion or the Great Rising. So this was a massive uprising that went down all over England in 1381. First, there were the economy and political tension caused by the Black Death, right? And then you had those crazy high taxes from the 100 Years War with France, and on top of that, the local leadership in London was all messed up. So this dude, as we know, our rebellion is Wat Tyler, right? He was the leading, the charge, inspired by sermons from a radical cleric named John Ball. So remember these two names, it's quite important. And this whole peasant revolt falls under them. So they are the one who started all these things. So the rebels from Kent marched their way to London, ready to kick some ass, right? So the royal government tried to talk them out of it. But what? Nothing happens. King Richard, who was just 14 years old at the time, ran off to the Tower of London for safety. So most of the royal forces were either out of the country or they went to the up north. And on June 13th, the rebel stormed into London, joined by a bunch of other pissed off locals, and they went on a rampage, attacking prisons, setting fire to the buildings, and killing anyone associated with the royal government. And the next day, Richard met with the rebels at Mile End. And what happened? And gave into most of their demands, like getting rid of serfdom. Meanwhile, some rebels even took over the Tower of London. And some important people like the Lord Chancellor and also the Lord High Treasurer. So it was like total chaos. Now that is all about the peasant revolt. Let's move. Text is Fall of Constantinople. So it was actually happened in 29th May 1453. It was like the conquest of Constantinople by Sultan Muhammad II of the Ottoman Empire. So the Byzantium Empire was on its last legs, and the Ottoman family what broke through the ancient land wall of Constantinople after a 55-day siege. So Muhammad had the city surrounded by from all sides and using cannons to blast the city wall like crazy. So with the fall of Constantinople, the one strong defense against Muslim invasion from Christian Europe was gone, giving the Ottomans a clear path for expanding into Eastern Europe. Right, and other event happened? The invention of printing, and that is where everything started. Right, all this literature, poem, and it also started. You know, also common people got to to read all these things. So the invention of printing press. All right, let's talk about that Wars of the Roses, which actually started from 1455 to 1485, where King Henry IV has kind of very weak little heart and was married to super ambitious French princess named Margaret of Anjou. But there was a drama at court. Powerful noble families were all up in each other's business, being all of jealous, and the queen and her crew were called Lancastrian because of Henry's last name, Lancaster. And on the other side, you had Richard, and who is the Duke of York, who was Henry's cousin, and also had a claim to the throne since he was descended from King Edward III, and whose crew was known as Yorkists. And Henry IV had some mental health issue also. And so when he went crazy in 1454, Richard of York was like, I got this, I'm the protector of the realm now. So he fired some of Queen's Lancastrian advisor, which caused some major drama. But then Henry recovered, and York got you know, worried. And the poor king couldn't control his ambitious wife and the Yorkist Earl of Warwick, who they called the Kingmaker. Both sides started gathering soldiers and preparing for war. So it was actually at that time it was easy to find soldiers because a bunch of soldiers had just came back from the Hundred Years' War, and in France uh, each side even had their own badge, and Lancaster had the red rose, and the York had what the white rose. And in 1455, just 2 years after the Hundred Years' War, you know, ended, all the things, what happened? They started civil war. So it was kind of brutal. The victors straight up what murdered the losers, and there were like bloodshed all over the place. So it was kind of total drama. Right. So this is all about the Wars of the Roses, as we know it happened 1455 to 1485. Now let's move some of the important battles in the War of the Roses. We have the first battle of the St. Albans, which happened around May 22nd, 1455. Then we have Battle of Blore Heath, September 23, 1459. Then we have the Battle of Northampton, then the second Battle of St. Albans, then the Battle of Taunton, Battle of Burnet, and Battle of Tewkesbury. So Battle of Bosworth also happened, and Battle of Stokefield. So these are all kind of very important battles in the Wars of the Roses. So that's all, my friend, for today. And next time we'll talk about the Middle English poetry. So before I go, you have to like the video if you can. It's good, and also subscribe the channel so you won't miss our next session, which will be about Middle English poetry. So that's all, guys, and I'll take a leave, and I'll see you in our next week. Thank you so much. Bye bye. Have a good day.